Hello, folks. Welcome to the SGDA Engineering Fireside Chat. Today we'll be joined by Ian Holstead of Respawn Entertainment. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name's Ian. I'm a software engineer on Apex Legends, working on gameplay. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah. I'm a news. You've seen me throughout the day, but in terms of where I fall into engineering, I'm actually planning on going to USC to get my master's in computer science with a focus in game development. So I hope to be kind of a good conversation partner for today's fireside chat. Um, I guess the first question I'd like to ask you is what first made you interested in game development and what's made you stay? Because you're a senior software engineer too.
yes. It's a good question, and I actually have a bit of a fun story in this regard. Back when I was a student, I'm Canadian, so I went to university, but college, same deal. My program had a lot of internships. Before I'd started college, I had never programmed before. I thought I was going to hate it. I thought it was going to be like learning the language and like I didn't want any of that nonsense. But I quickly got into it, loved it, and started doing internships at various companies. My program actually had 6 internships throughout the course of the program. And like my first one was on like quality assurance, which made sense. I'd only been programming for 4 months. And then, I got into web development. And on my third internship, I was actually working at an insurance company in the US. Um, it was a little lonely. I was kind of out in the middle of nowhere um, and playing games with my friends a lot. And the job was challenging in that they kind of gave me like a really big task with no guidance and said, good luck.
Yes,
Uh,
the classic of figure this out. How? Good luck.
yeah, exactly. The team I was on, the whole application was on fire. It was like crashing every day, and my manager was
No.
just spending all day looking at logs, trying to figure out what was going on. Anyways, it was at that point I was playing a lot of Borderlands 2 with my friends. And that was sort of how I was keeping in touch with people. And I found out they had a dev blog. And reading through that, they had really interesting stories about how they used really cool ideas to make the game better without incurring like a huge engineering cost. They talked about how they faked like a buddy AI because they didn't have one, and that
Oh,
improved like the gameplay and the story and the characters, and all just by sort of using what they had in a really smart way. I said, that's super cool. I want to do that. And then I just downloaded Unreal Engine and, started entering game jams and um, it was a bit of a journey. I never actually got into a games internship, but I managed to land a position at Ubisoft Montreal when I graduated. And yeah, things have kind of gone from there. As for sort of why I've decided to stay in the industry, it's a lot of fun. There's quite often, you're discussing with somebody and you're like, how is this real? You know, on the last project I worked on, which was Assassin's Creed Valhalla, it was like, oh, we're talking about like, oh, you swing like this and like their head comes off, and you're like, what is real life, How is this
the
my job?
disconnect is just very present, and you have a moment of like, huh, that's not
Yeah.
a. This is a really
Uh,
interesting conversation to be having.
exactly. So, but just like I love gameplay specifically. That's sort of what I work on, and it's just this really fun balance between, the engineering challenges, but also like the creative and design side where, your end goal isn't to do something that's correct, right? Your end goal is to make something that's fun.
Right.
And it turns out that correct often isn't necessarily fun. I mean, look no further than statistics, right? But you can sort of, use your engineering skills to build something that feels good and then have other people get hands on it and stuff, and that's really rewarding. So that's
Right.
kind of why I decided to, stick around.
That idea that fun doesn't necessarily mean correct is really interesting because a lot of times, like one of the reasons why I'm not a huge fan of survival games personally
Hmm.
is because the hunger mechanics stress me out a lot, like they do in real life. And so sometimes you need to like making those sacrifices to make the game more fun to play. To hearing that Borderlands 2 didn't have proper buddy AI is fascinating to me because that's like that I would not have expected that at all.
Yeah, so they actually did. end up making a buddy AI. But back at this point in development, when they were working on this, was actually the first time you meet Lilith. That whole
Mm.
encounter, she has no AI. And they just sort of scripted it by saying, like, oh, if there's enemies nearby, then like she teleports in and triggers an explosion, and the enemies say, oh, I took damage from her, so I should target her. And then she just says, like, all she can do is walk. And that's all she does. But they're like, oh, well, but she can teleport. That's like her thing.
Yeah, that makes
Uh,
sense with the narrative as well.
exactly.
I
So
might need to replay that and see that mission again because I've replayed that section so many times growing up.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
that's really interesting. Okay. And that is technically in some ways like an AI, it's more of a response system than an AI. Because it's more like if like it's that joke of AI is a lot of if else blocks, but in this case, it
exactly.
actually is that.
Yeah. Well, but that's kind of the thing. It's just like, I mean, especially when it comes to game AI, I spent a lot of time doing that on my last job and a little bit on my current job. But AI is so vague and nebulous in games, right? Because I mean, there's lots of conversations about AI and machine learning and stuff these days, but we almost never apply them for game AIs. And naturally, it's because the objective in AI isn't to win. It's very easy to make an AI that is
Oh yeah.
very good. It's hard to make an AI that's fun. And so a lot of cases, you end up doing a lot of manual, oh, handle this case, right? And you start sort of scripting the AI. And so there's a really like there's not a clean cutoff between like a purely systemic and like a scripted, right?
Mhm.
All of these will have, exceptional cases. And so, it's just that type of AI was very on the scripted side, and there are other ones that are much more on the systemic side.
Right. Like one of the people say like, "Oh, why isn't this AI super realistic?" And I'm thinking because if it was, you would uninstall this game in a heartbeat.
Well, I mean, I read a really good story one time of somebody who was saying they had like a top-down turn-based strategy game, and there was fog of war in the game, and
Oh,
there was like players could block a door and the enemies could like path around the level and figure out how to get around. And the players went, oh, well, you just teleport the enemies behind me. And the guy's going like, I did all this work making the AI so smart. But if
a
you
poor
players
engineer.
can't distinguish between the AI being smart and the game cheating.
Yeah, definitely. That's
Um,
that's a huge point. Like an AI can just zip to like in a shooter, it can just zip to you and like fire and get
mhm.
you. But that's not going to be fun. That's gonna be really frustrating.
Well, for sure, but I mean, on the flip side, teleporting an enemy in behind you and having some sort of sneak attack also in some
That could
situations
work.
could work.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, the one of the words of wisdom I've seen for AI is if you want to make an AI seem smarter, give it more health. Basically,
Ah,
like anything you that an AI is doing that is out of view is like no one knows, right?
yeah.
And same sort of thing where it's just like AIs have often way more behaviors than you'd see because they kind of die. And so if you just have them live longer, they tend to be like, oh wow, they do all these cool things. It's just like, yeah, they always did that, but we just
You
killed
never
them too
saw it because
fast.
they I know the
Yeah.
game Fear was and still is in a lot of ways very well renowned for its AI.
Hmm.
And a lot of that is like them working with the level designers. So they'll make call outs that internally modern game AIs are doing, but they just don't verbalize it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And I believe Fear 3 specifically is also one of the first games to use goal-oriented action planning.
oh, wow,
Um,
okay.
which was it's been used by a lot of games. Actually, that was what we used on Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Um, and it's a pretty cool decision-making method. It has strengths and has weaknesses, I'll be honest, but it's very good about building highly systemic AI. It can sort of do things like, oh, I want to attack you. In order to attack you, I need to go and pick up a weapon. And the AI just kind of figures that out and does it all automatically. So
Oh, yeah. Interesting. That makes sense actually. That Fear 3, this would be part of that series' legacy.
yeah. Hmm.
Uh, I guess we can ask another question from our list, which
Yeah.
is what technical skills are the most in demand right now?
Yeah, this is a bit of a tricky one.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, in terms of engineering, lots. Um, and I mean, other technical skills as well, like tech art and stuff like that, always highly in demand. Um, In terms of engineering specifically, I would probably say UI is what I've seen to be the most in demand, UI engineers. But there's, I mean, all kinds of disciplines, lots of people are hiring. I'd say the challenges maybe are gameplay is sometimes the most popular one, so it can be a bit tougher to get into as a junior. I'd say it's very approachable in terms of skill set. You can develop those skills on your own by, downloading game engines and trying stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, it is sometimes the sexy game engineering. But the other ones that I'd say are kind of tricky are probably like graphics and engine, and like more really niche ones like audio or animation. And those just require really, really deep knowledge, skill sets. Graphics in particular just keeps getting more and more and more advanced by the year. And so I think that there's lots of companies that are willing to hire junior and train the people. But at the same time, it sometimes can be hard to approach without even like a master's. So that's, a little tricky, but yeah, I'd say just generally engineers are pretty in demand these days.
I know one of the things when I've been taking like technical interviews for game positions specifically, like
Hmm.
I'll get asked the algorithm questions that are kind of that I would see in a software engineering job, but I'd also get asked math like 3D math questions. So
Yes.
given these vectors, how would they interact?
Yeah.
And what are some good resources that students can kind of brush up on their like 3D math, in your opinion?
Yeah. Well, for so there's variety, there's levels, right? Roles like animation engineering and so on require that you have really solid, deep 3D math. Matrix manipulation, quaternions should not be too spooky for you. Fortunately for gameplay engineering, the demands are a little bit less high. Um, for if you're looking to apply as a gameplay engineer, and I highly recommend that you 100% understand the dot product and the cross product, and that's all you need.
Okay.
Um, and on one hand, it's just like, oh, that's it. Yep, that's it. But you eh, it maybe wasn't when I started, but like by this point in my career, for example, like, the dot product's just second nature to me. I
Mhm.
completely can understand. And at school, you're kind of doing like word problems, like you're writing your own word problems and then having to solve them, right? So, and then in terms of like where you'd brush up your skills, I I'm honestly a big proponent of just trying and building stuff yourself, especially for gameplay. If you think about, a cool mechanic you've seen in a game, how do you do that? How do you make that? How do you make wall running? How do you make a gun that shoots? How do you make a gun that shoots bullets that reflect off walls? Um, and quickly you will find what skills you need to develop in order to build these things. And then, it's just searching online mostly. But the tricky part is kind of knowing what you even need to ask.
Definitely. There's a channel, Mix and Jam, I believe, who likes to recreate popular game mechanics in
Mm,
Unity, and they're a really good resource for that. When I was making a game for an SGDA jam, I
hmm
was thinking, okay, the way that the player kind of engages with the enemy instead of like slashing at them, since it was a top-down game,
hmm
is if they click on the enemy stops, and if they click again, they can kind of rotate the enemy in one of the four cardinal directions.
hmm
There was no tutorials out there of how to do that in Godot specifically.
Yeah.
So I kind of had to, it was kind of a process of this is how you interact, like taking different parts of stuff and putting it together
hmm
in a way that ended up working out, I think, pretty well.
Yep. Yeah, and increasingly, building mechanics for games is, just sort of understanding your fundamental tools and applying them in, smart ways.
Right. There's no one size fits all. It's
Exactly.
very specific to what you're doing.
Yeah. But once you sort of get the base tools figured out, every engine will have those tools. And so, like, I've worked in Unreal, I've worked in Unity. I guess I'm old enough that Godot wasn't really much of a thing when I was getting started, and I mean, I've used like Anvil Scimitar, which is the Assassin's Creed engine, as well as like Rainbow Six and all those other games.
So
And then,
proprietary engines
yeah,
for specific like games and companies.
yeah. And then as well, like on my current job, we use Resource, which is a branch of the Source engine.
Oh, yes.
So at this point, I've seen really big spectrums. Like, you know, I've seen how proprietary engines are similar or different from commercially available public engines. But at the end of the day, if you look at what's kind of available, like the core pieces are all the same, right? You
Right.
know, you've got your vector math libraries, you've got vectors, you know, you've got raycasts and trace types, you've got triggers, you've got entities. At the end of the day, they're all sort of the same.
If an engine doesn't have dot product across product functionality, there's a separate that's somebody that's the engine
Yeah,
engineer's
that's
part.
that's you don't really have an engine at that point.
That's something that you kind of fundamentally need.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. For our next question, I'd like to ask, how has the industry changed in the last 5 years, and what do you predict for the future? Because right now we're in a very interesting part of the industries in terms of employment and the available tools to us.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'd say probably the biggest change in the last 5 years is work from home.
Okay.
Before the pandemic, there was very little work from home. The expectation was that you were in the office. If you wanted to move companies, you were moving wherever that was. That's something I'd done. You know, both companies I worked at, I moved to the cities. I never lived there before. So work from home is probably the biggest change. I would say it's maybe a little bit longer than 5 years, but I would say the attitudes around company retention has changed as well. You know, you used to hear back in the day where you need very few people at the start of a project, and you need very few people at the end of a project. And so they would basically hire everyone in the middle and then just lay them all off at the end. And I think increasingly that doesn't really happen anymore
Mhm.
because companies have realized that, I mean, as there are more companies, more competition, but you need to keep your people and train them. And so I think previously there still is a lot of turnover, especially with the pandemic. There can be challenges around like sometimes it's really hard to get promoted within a company,
Mhm.
or like, you know, your salary just kind of goes up incrementally. And then if you jump, you can get a huge jump. And then if you go back, you could get a jump again. And it's just like, but why? So there's still some transition there, but I would say that, you know, it's probably more like 10 years than 5 years, but there's been a little bit of a change about companies really wanting to keep people, which is good for us.
Yes.
Um, in terms of what the future holds, it's a really good question. I would probably say one of the trends I'm seeing, which is maybe a little bit worrying, is that game development cycles are increasingly what I refer to as kind of unsustainable.
Mhm.
Games are getting bigger and more complex and are taking longer and longer to build. My previous rule of thumb used to be like if a game took more than 5 years to make, something went wrong, right? They had to
Right.
restart production, they changed direction, something like that. It doesn't mean that the game ended, you know, the product that they may have shipped may have been good, but it was really rough getting there. And so, like, an example in my mind was like BioShock Infinite. That game took like 7 years or something. And I heard they made enough content to make like 2 or 3 games.
Yeah,
And I
and
think,
like,
well, I mean, after the game shipped, the whole studio imploded.
and you kind of
Um,
see what happened. Like, and now and that I see what you mean about like, you hear stories now about games that have been in development for so long, and it's like that's not like you said, it's not sustainable. And I don't how much are you like what's happening? It feels and it ends up being a lot of these games kind of end up having issues with crunch or issues with how employees are treated.
yeah, I mean, crunch is definitely another one of the things that's improving.
Right.
It goes in with the retention as well. Is um, I mean, for example, right now I work on a live game. Apex is, you know, coming out all the time. We do releases every month and a half. Um, and they simply realized that like if we crunch, there's no time to recover, and there's a huge effort to prevent people at the studio from crunching. Doesn't mean we do perfect, but you know, there's a really big effort there from the team. And I would say increasingly, you know, there are projects like Cyberpunk and stuff like this where, you know, they sort of had to crunch to death. I have no idea how the development of Tears of the Kingdom went, but I didn't hear anything about widespread crunch.
I have heard Monolith Soft, the development studio that primarily handled it, is kind of a studio that's known for not crunching their employees. They worked on Xenoblade Chronicles 3 as well.
Yeah.
So that's another company that I have that's part of why I look at the Tears of the Kingdom and I think it like you don't need to crunch. Like you don't.
Yeah. I mean, Tears of the Kingdom is, of course, like a unique situation because basically the game is going to make a pile of money regardless of when it released,
Yeah.
and they weren't under pressure to release too soon, right?
Mhm.
And I think, I mean, Nintendo and first parties are a little bit weird, but like, I do think that like the reason Cyberpunk released when it did was because they were a publicly traded company. They had to.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, you compare that to a company like Epic or Valve, they can just kind of work on their own timelines. Both of them are a bit different because they also have stores and stuff, and that can support their other revenue streams. But most recently, like I look at Diablo 4, right? Diablo
Mhm.
4 took like 7 years to make. I don't think it was a particularly rough development. I was not super familiar, but I didn't hear reports of widespread crunch, and the game launched well. But it was just a very big game to make.
Yeah.
And, you know, like Elder Scrolls 6
Or
is going to be like, you know, very long development cycle.
and
It probably will
Starfield
be,
was just recently
yeah,
with that getting
exactly.
announced.
So basically like the biggest games are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Um, and so I think the industry is going to have to adjust to that. I who knows, maybe we'll hit a point where because increasingly like the most successful games are getting more successful than ever before, right?
Mhm.
And that's why there's a desire to make these really, really big games because they can just be on such different levels. But it
Look at the
doesn't mean
sales of
that
like
they're
Elden
successful.
Ring versus other games that FromSoft has made. That's like, and that was a lot. Similarly, like I don't know how the working situation was, but that probably took a while to develop. There's a reason why there was such a long period of silence between announcing and releasing just last year.
Yeah, yeah, no doubt about it. But yeah, it's crazy how big games are. And to put things in perspective, Elden Ring was not a big game.
Yeah, but
It was a good game and very successful for FromSoft. And I don't think anyone's upset about it. I'm not saying Elden Ring's a bad game in any way, but you know, you compare it to lots of other games, particularly live games, it's like peanuts.
yeah, like
So
it. You mentioned earlier talking about how you want to retain employees, and I think one thing that my dad was telling me, he's a software engineer, is that you want this also because that way people who know the stack code and know how things work aren't
yeah,
going to leave and leave new people like trying to learn and implement new stuff at the same time, which
yeah,
is like laying the tracks in front of you. I've used this in the production panel as well.
yeah, yeah. I mean, ultimately, every project has a lot of, you know, somebody's written something in some way for some reason. And as much as you can try and share that knowledge broadly, there will always be things that, you know, you have to learn pitfalls of your specific tools and how to work. And onboarding somebody does take a lot of effort, and when somebody leaves, you lose a lot of knowledge with them. So yeah, no doubt about it.
Definitely. I'd like to ask a question that came from the audience.
Yeah.
Um, some Solid Parker, Peter has some questions about workflow. What
Mhm.
version control software do you use, and how often would you branch team projects?
Yeah. So both the companies I've been at have used Perforce. Um, Git, I think, is extremely uncommon in the industry, and is because it does not deal well with exclusive checkout. At the end of the day, I've used Git on a lot of my personal projects, and you know, game jams and stuff, we've had to like, oh, only the person holding the jar of Nutella can submit the level because suddenly two people submit a level and then one person loses all their work, right? That's
Yeah,
obviously just not an option on big teams and stuff like that. So Perforce is pretty industry standard. Fortunately, it's really easy to use. So if you've ever used version control, it's pretty basic. And then how often do we branch? I mean, not often. A lot of working in main. You know, sometimes you'll branch for releases and
oh
just pull in
yeah,
specific stuff for release, and you have a release branch. But and sometimes if you're working on like a really big refactor or something, they'll like split off a branch for that. But most of the time you're just working in one mainline branch. Chaos.
I remember when Fallout 76, there was a patch that happened that
Hmm.
reverted the game, a lot of the bug fixes, because they were working from a earlier patch
Yeah.
in the git in the branching, and I was like, oh no, that must have been like that nightmare, that programmer's worst nightmare of
Yeah.
is that happening?
Yeah. I mean, especially like on a live game, for example, the build and release team is really critical and they have a lot of pretty challenging work trying to keep that all sorted. And if you're pulling in fixes for specific releases, you need to make sure the next release doesn't lose those changes. And Perforce has a tool called Revision Graph where you can see where your change has been and moved from branch to branch, and a lot of looking at that sometimes.
Right. And I know with Git, I just yesterday when trying to push a project that we're working on for SGDA, it had an issue with something that was 100 megabytes, and things will be more than 100 megabytes in game development. So I was thinking, okay, maybe for next year's version of this, we should use a different version control. So I'll start looking into Perforce myself.
Yeah, I think it's not the world's easiest thing to set up yourself. I think they've tried to make it a bit easier, but I've always just like even on my personal projects, I still use Git just because GitHub free.
It doesn't work as for games as well as it
Yeah,
does for other pieces of software.
for sure.
Maybe for working on the EA Play, the launcher, maybe that there they use Git,
Yeah,
because
potentially.
um, for my next question, I'd like to ask, what should someone do in order to excel when they're first starting out a job?
Hmm.
Document things like documentation, kind of writing comments in their code.
Yeah, so my short answer is I mean documentation can be good, especially if you're new and that you've seen flaws in the process. Like, oh, I had to go and learn about these things. Setting it up for whoever comes after you is good. But I wouldn't say that either of those are the most important things. To me, the most important thing, which is going to sound really boring, is to come in well rested. Um, it's crazy. Having a good night of sleep is a superpower. It'll make you way more productive at work. But overall, I like to see people who are full of energy, ready to learn, is really the most important thing. They're going to be receiving a lot of information, and being able to understand that, parse that, and sort of store it or write it down, and having the energy to do that, be willing to scribble down all these notes that you're getting. Ultimately, like even the process of launching the game could be, something you have to learn. Probably will. Every studio will have its own different tools and different ways of working, and oh, you need to use this command line argument to launch with these settings and so on. And that's just, everyone's just like, oh yeah, you just do that. And you're gonna have to learn that on your first day.
Yeah, definitely.
So, um, and then, ultimately, like, no matter where you go, even if you've used a bunch of Unreal, you're going to a studio that uses Unreal, their setup is going to be different and unique. And at the end of the day, you're just going to have to learn a ton. And so being ready to learn and being excited is to me the sort of key things.
That makes a lot of sense. Kind of that willingness to learn is something that will always be useful, even for other fields, because this game development is it is a very technical field. It also is very interdisciplinary
Yep,
in a way that's kind of very it's in a way that's unique to it.
for sure.
Uh, I myself I found a position type called technical narrative design that I've been
Yep,
thinking that might be my end goal, but I but at the same time it's like I'm gonna have to learn a lot
yep,
as I go along.
yep.
Um, for the next question, I'd like to ask, how has working from home affected you, your team, or your past experiences working as a game developer, especially if you're working with the Apex team during the work from home period? I'm not
Yep.
sure if Respawn is still doing work from home or if they've returned to the office.
Yep. No, Respawn is embraced remote work. So people can be remote or they can come into the office now. Most people are remote, but yeah, I mean, I was shipping Assassin's Creed Valhalla during the pandemic. I got sent home. I had somebody come to my desk and say, "Get out of here." And I mean, we shipped November 2020. right? So we finalized the whole game while learning to work remotely. And it honestly wasn't that bad. Um, we had, a bunch of tools people really step up, because there's stuff like, oh yeah, we use, remote desktop or some sort of software connect. Doesn't send you game controller controls.
Ye- Oh
And
God.
the way that the engine was set up was when you're developing on AC, you have to use a controller. The mouse and keyboard, every button on the keyboard was a shortcut for something. And so
Oh, that
by
makes
default,
sense.
you couldn't use the keyboard for anything. And it was a console first game historically.
Mhm. Yeah,
So
definitely.
it makes sense. But yeah, and so, there's just all these problems that had to be overcome. At first, as everyone was on remote, working remotely, connecting remotely, there'd be a time around like 2 p.m. where like it was just kind of slow to a crawl. And so, at first I had to do like oh, I'll take a nap and then like I go back to work later and like I take my like evening in the middle of the afternoon instead. Um yeah, that like first section of work from home was it, I mean, in some ways it never changed. I knew the team super well and it was kind of like, you know, just the same, except instead of walking to somebody's desk, you just, called them. We could do screen share, we could, take control of people's mouse and keyboard and help
Hmm.
do stuff virtually and stuff. So in some ways it wasn't very different. It was maybe a little bit isolating, but that was the start of the pandemic for you. It's just
Yeah.
very isolating in general. Um, excuse me. But other than that, I mean, people have kind of learned how to work remotely. Um, it's, just kind of become part of your day. Lots of people really enjoy it. Some people much prefer to be in the office, but sort of to each their own. I know some people have moved much further away from the office and enabled them to buy a house and stuff like
Mm.
this, which they wouldn't have been able to in the city.
Right.
And some people just like Respawn's head office is in LA. LA traffic is quite something, and so a lot of people just save a lot of time each day by not having to commute. But again, some people really love that environment, and some people did struggle a bunch because they didn't have that environment. So it's a little bit of a vague answer, but it was a thing, and we learned to
Yeah.
deal with it.
I myself am going from the Bay Area to LA in fall, so that the LA traffic is something that I'm very scared about.
Yep.
We have another question. Do you think that technology will help alleviate or solve issues with that arise from the bigger development cycles that can potentially be unsustainable, like you mentioned?
TBD. Um, Ultimately, I mean, there is a lot of technology used. Every big game these days uses procedural generation.
Hmm.
And lots of people think of procedural generation like No Man's Sky, but if you look at the world of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, for example, like a lot of it is procedurally generated, it's hand-tuned, right? But there's so much that you have to build, it's not practical to place every, 200,000 bushes in a level, right? There's just a tool where you can paint bushes, or you lay out and say this is a farm field, and it just generates a farm field for you. So yes, I mean, there's no doubt that we have used technology to enable us to build bigger and bigger and bigger games. Obviously, the big kind of technology question these days is generative AI. Um, I I'm not the expert. I'll be honest. To pretend that it's not going to make a difference in the industry, I think is wrong. I do think it will make a change. There's a lot of questions on what and how. Um, I know personally I've been a little reluctant to dive into it just because I sort of see how much hurt it's caused a lot of communities. But it's not to say that the technology itself is fundamentally evil. It's easily misused. And so there's a lot of things figuring that out right now. Um, you know, Whether that be on the code side, generative code now, generation, um, or there's like Ubisoft said that they have generative AI helping writers, for example. And I know like that got a lot of backlash, but like the Ubisoft writers themselves had said, no, this is actually good. It's
Mhm.
taking away all these really boring writing barks and stuff, like helping me spend the time on the more interesting parts of my job and remove the boring ones.
Got it.
And I mean, I think that's where the technology is ultimately going to shine in the same way that like I have a place that has a dishwasher now. I hate washing dishes, right? It enables me to do more interesting things. I could spend more time cooking and less time cleaning. And in the same sort of way, is, how think about how many writers have written some sort of like lookout. They've written 100,000 lookout lines, right? They're over there. Oh, it was
Yeah,
just the wind. Is that where writers are best spending their time? Or, is there more compelling things that they could be doing which will ultimately help game narrative? I'm not a writer. Not going to try and pretend that I am, but so I do think there's opportunity there. There's no doubt that it is the hot thing right now, but lots of companies are moving very cautiously, which is good. So
definitely.
it's still TBD.
uh I think it's definitely something that it's a lot about how you use it
Yep.
rather than the thing itself. Like as this way of supplanting creatives, it's not going to work at all. In terms of just, I know there's the Hawken game, which recently used AI to generate its full-on story cutscenes,
Mhm.
and that did not land well. We have one more question before we wrap this up.
Mhm.
Uh, were there any projects or experiences that was insightful for when you were trying to break up or break into the industry?
Yeah, breaking into the industry is definitely the toughest part, unfortunately. The industry is really excited about hiring seniors and very bad about hiring juniors, which is really dumb because seniors don't come out of thin air.
Yeah.
Just to put things kind of in perspective, so I had done 6 full-time internships, which I had been paid for, and so that was about 2 years worth of work experience. And I graduated with a computer engineering degree, not in games. And when I graduated, I, started applying places and I couldn't even get anyone to respond. There was one position as a junior gameplay programmer on Anthem, which I was super excited for. I spent like a week putting an application together for, and like I never even heard back. I had another recruiter I knew in EA, so I messaged her being like, "Hey, I never even heard back from this." And then like a day later, I heard back saying no. Um, and then ultimately, I ended up on Assassin's Creed Valhalla. So not to say bad things about Anthem, I had friends who worked on it, but I kind of dodged a bullet there. But
Especially with how EA treated the potential to reboot that game.
yeah,
Um,
I mean, lots of challenges around that game. But
yeah.
anyways, but yeah, and then so the only reason I kind of really landed the job I did was because I had gone to an in-person industry conference in Montreal and I met a bunch of recruiters and handed out a lot of resumes and got an interview from that where they were hiring new grads. Um, and that was great, and it got my career started. And then when I left Ubisoft and was applying elsewhere, every single company I applied to got back to me with an interview, and that was just 3 years experience. So breaking in is definitely the toughest part. I don't want to pretend that like, this is the one trick or this it's going to be easy, and I don't want to dissuade people either to say that it's going to be impossible. Lots of people are very successful. If it's not too late and you can land an internship with a company, that's almost a guaranteed in. Not guaranteed, but almost. Most companies I worked at that had internships, the reason they're doing internships is to hire new grads. So that's a really good way to get in if you can. If you're sort of already past that point, um, for gameplay specifically, I mean, make sure that you have built games, have personal projects that you work on, gain experience with the engine. It's definitely going to show there. I built a portfolio online that had my games visible. I think people don't really look at it very often, but it's definitely a good thing to do. Really like really well written, actually personalized cover letters can be good as well because the first hurdle you've got to get over is the recruiter. And they might look at your portfolio, but ultimately like they're really excited about you caring, I guess.
Definitely.
And if you have any connections, that makes a really big difference too. So, reaching out to people who are that maybe are in the industry, or if you can go to in-person networking events and stuff like that, that can help as well. But I mean, I just encourage people not to give up hope. I think, especially once you sort of get through that first hurdle, it's, programmers in particular are really in demand these days. So I think you're well set up for a good career. It's just it can be a bit tricky. Oh, and make sure you get somebody to review your resume. That's another one. I've seen a lot of less than great resumes. It's not that they weren't good, it's just that, sometimes the resume is full of a lot of nothing. You know, oh, I helped build a thing. Okay. Ew.
So definitely that kind of getting that specific, like being specific in your resume, but how you contributed
Yeah,
is really important.
yeah.
As somebody who's been polishing my resume for a while, I've been seeing that a lot and hearing it too. But yeah, I think that's going to be the end of this block. Thank you, Ian, so much for coming to speak with us. It was really good getting to talk with you, and the answers that you gave were really insightful and really encouraging.
Thank
So
you. Thank
thank you
you.
all so much.
Well, best of luck, everyone.
Yes. For everybody who next up will have the representation of women in games micro talk. We'll be transitioning that at around 5:30, and see you all then.